In the dust-swept silence of the Nile's western bank, where sandstone meets sky and shadow, there stands a temple carved not into earth but into eternity itself. Here, in the sacred geometry of Abu Simbel, four colossal faces gaze across the desert, each bearing the features of a king who refused to be forgotten. These are the faces of Ramses, hewn from living rock, emerging from the cliff as if the mountain itself had dreamed him into being. The statues do not merely sit, they wait. They are guardians of threshold between mortal ambition and divine persistence. Each figure rises 60 feet from desert floor to crowned summit, carved from the cliff face in single continuous form so that mountain and monument become inseparable. The stone is the color of honey in certain light, of blood in others, of shadow when the sun descends and the desert cools. The faces are identical yet distinct, the same features repeated 4 times, as if Ramses understood that one image might be forgotten but 4 might persist. That redundancy becomes its own form of immortality. Behind these sentinels, chambers descend into darkness. Corridors lead not to burial but to remembrance, halls where sunlight penetrates only twice each year on February 22 and October 22, dates that mark Ramses' birthday and his coronation. On these days, dawn light travels the length of the temple's interior, illuminating first the hypostyle hall with its 8 pillars shaped as Osiris, then the sanctuary itself where 4 seated figures wait in perpetual darkness. The light touches 3 of them, Ra-Horakhti, Ramses himself, and Amun-Ra. The 4th figure, Ta, god of darkness, remains always in shadow, untouched by sun even on these ordained days when light invades the temple's depths. The alignment is not accident. Was calculated with precision that required understanding of astronomy and solar cycles, that demanded years of observation before the first stone was cut. The temple was positioned so that sunrise on these specific days would travel 180 feet through the interior, would transform the sanctuary from place of shadow to place of revelation, would demonstrate that the pharaoh who built this monument commanded not just labor and stone but celestial mechanics themselves. The light's journey became ritual, became proof of divine favor, became annual reminder that Ramses had bound his reign not just to earth but to heaven's movements. Yet the temple was built in Nubia, in territory that Ramses conquered early in his reign, in land inhabited by peoples who did not recognize Egyptian gods or Egyptian authority. The monument served dual purpose, was place of worship but also declaration of dominion, was temple but also fortress of stone, was sacred architecture but also political statement carved where conquered peoples could not ignore it. The 4 faces gazed south, toward Nubia, as if watching for rebellion, as if warning that Egyptian power extended even here, even to the edge of the known world. The local populations called the temple the Mountain of Pharaoh, recognized it as foreign imposition, as architecture of occupation. Inside the temple, reliefs cover every available surface. They show Ramses in battle at Kadesh, his chariot charging into enemy lines, arrows bouncing harmlessly from his chest, the gods themselves fighting beside him. They show him making offerings to the gods, receiving crowns and was-scepters, standing as equal among divine beings. They show him smiting enemies, his arm raised in eternal gesture of conquest, captured peoples kneeling beneath his feet. The reliefs are propaganda carved in stone, are historical records shaped by royal necessity, are truth selected and arranged to create specific narrative about power and divine favor and the inevitability of Egyptian triumph. But the reliefs also reveal something about memory, about how it is constructed. About how stones remember not what happened, but what someone wanted remembered. The Battle of Kadesh that dominates the temple's interior walls was not the clear victory the reliefs proclaim, was actually strategic stalemate that ended in negotiated peace. But Ramses commissioned the battle's depiction across temples throughout Egypt, created visual narrative so compelling that it became historical truth despite contradicting the actual outcome. The stone remembers what Ramses told it to remember. It forgets what he chose to leave uncarved. The temple speaks in the language of permanence. 60 feet of carved stone declaring that some names will not dissolve into the breath of time. Yet within this monument to immortality lives quieter question: what compels a pharaoh to carve his likeness into mountains? What fear hides beneath such towering certainty? What mortality haunts such extreme claims of immortality? The stone faces hold their silence, offering no answer save the weight of their presence. When the Aswan High Dam was built in the 1960s, the temple faced drowning beneath the reservoir that would form behind the dam. UNESCO organized an international effort to save it, cutting the temple into blocks, moving it to higher ground, reassembling it with such precision that the solar alignment still functions on those 2 days each year. The relocation was engineering marvel, was testament to the temple's continued power to compel effort and resources from peoples who shared neither Ramses' religion nor his political authority. 3,000 years after construction, the temple still demanded recognition, still insisted on preservation, still exercised power through its massive presence. Today, tourists arrive by bus and boat to stand before the colossal statues. They take photographs that capture scale but not weight, that show features but not presence, that record visit but cannot convey the peculiar silence that gathers around monuments so large they seem to bend space around themselves. The temple has become destination, has transformed from sacred architecture to tourist attraction, has shifted from place of worship to place of wonder. Yet something of its original power persists. The faces still gaze across desert, still wait with stone patience, still refuse to explain what drove Ramses to carve them or what they mean beyond their overwhelming assertion of presence. As the sun sets behind them, shadows pool in the hollows of their eyes, and for a moment the eternal seems fragile stone that remembered everything, yet cannot speak of what it cost to be remembered. The temple darkens, the desert cools. And the four faces continue their vigil, watching over emptiness, monuments to a king who understood that memory requires not truth but repetition, not accuracy but insistence, not what happened but what is carved into stone too massive to ignore. On the banks of the Orontes River, where Syrian soil drinks the mingled waters of courage and blood, a young pharaoh found himself surrounded by enemy chariots, his army scattered, his divine protection tested by cold iron and calculated strategy. This was Kadesh, a battle that Ramses would claim as his greatest triumph, though historians whisper of different truth hidden beneath the royal proclamations. The year was 1274 BCE. Ramses was 25 years old in the 5th year of his reign, leading Egyptian forces north into Syria, where the Hittite Empire had been expanding its influence, claiming territories that Egypt considered within its sphere of control. The city of Kadesh was strategic prize, controlled trade routes connecting Egypt to Asia Minor, sat at crossroads of empires. Both powers claimed it. Both powers were willing to fight for it. Ramses divided his army into 4 divisions, each named for a god: Amun, Ra, Ta, and Seth. He led the Amun division at the front of the march, confident in Egyptian military superiority, trusting reports from captured spies who claimed the Hittite army was still far to the north, not yet arrived in the Kadesh region. The intelligence was deliberate deception. The Hittite king Muwatalli II had positioned his forces on the far side of Kadesh, hidden from Egyptian scouts waiting for opportunity to strike. When Ramses and the Amun division reached Kadesh and began establishing camp, the Hittite chariots attacked. They struck the Ra division as it approached, catching it in column formation, most vulnerable position for ancient military forces. The Ra division broke, soldiers fleeing in panic, survivors streaming toward the camp where Ramses waited. The Hittite chariots pursued, crashed into the Egyptian camp, surrounded the young pharaoh whose divine authority suddenly seemed inadequate defense against 2,000 enemy chariots and their disciplined crews. What happened next depends on who tells the story. According to the Egyptian version carved on temple walls from Abu Simbel to Karnak, written in papyrus accounts, proclaimed in poetic form called the Poem of Pentuer, Ramses stood alone, betrayed by his fleeing troops, abandoned by his generals, facing impossible odds. He called out to the god Amun, demanding divine assistance, and Amun responded, filled Ramses with divine strength, made his arm mighty, his aim perfect, his courage limitless. Ramses charged into the enemy, his horses becoming wind, his chariot becoming thunder. He killed enemies by hundreds, by thousands. His arrows never missed, his sword never faltered. The enemy chariots collapsed before him like reeds before flood. The reliefs show him towering above his enemies, show arrows bouncing harmlessly from his chest, show his horses trampling enemy soldiers, show him single-handedly turning the tide of battle. Show the Hittite forces breaking, fleeing, drowning in the Orontes River in their panic to escape the pharaoh's wrath. The images are vivid, are detailed, are carved with such conviction that they create reality through sheer insistence on their own truth. But the Hittite records tell different story, tell of battle that ended in stalemate, tell of both sides suffering heavy casualties. They tell of Ramses barely escaping with his life, saved not by divine intervention but by the arrival of Egyptian reinforcements, the narration, a force of mercenaries or elite troops whose timely appearance allowed Ramses to fight his way out of encirclement. The Hittite account does not describe Egyptian victory, describes tactical situation that forced both sides to disengage, to withdraw, to count losses rather than claim triumph. Neither side achieved decisive victory at Kadesh. Both armies withdrew after the battle. The city remained under Hittite control. No territorial changes resulted from the fighting. By any objective military assessment, the battle was draw, possibly even tactical defeat for Ramses, whose army was caught unprepared and nearly destroyed. Yet Ramses transformed this ambiguous outcome into legendary triumph, commissioned reliefs across every temple he built or restored, ordered the poem celebrating his valor recited at festivals, made Kadesh central to his royal identity, defining moment of his reign, proof of divine favor and military genius. The transformation reveals something about power and narrative, reveals that history belongs to those who carve it in stone, that legends are built from selective remembering, from choosing which details to emphasize and which to let drift into silence. Ramses understood that what matters is not what happened, but what is proclaimed to have happened, not the outcome but the story, not the reality but the representation that persists across time. In the temple reliefs, Kadesh became not battle but mythology, became story of young king tested and proven, of divine favor demonstrated through impossible odds overcome, of Egypt's power confirmed despite challenge from mighty enemy. The reliefs serve not as historical record but as theological statement that Ramses was beloved of gods, that his rule was divinely ordained, that opposition to him was opposition to divine will itself and therefore doomed to failure. Yet within the relief certainty lives uncertainty. Why insist so strenuously on victory unless victory needed insistence? Why carve the battle across every available surface unless the truth required overwhelming in visual repetition? Why return again and again to this single battle across 40-year building program unless something about it demanded continued assertion, continued proclamation, continued effort to shape memory into desired form? 16 years after Kadesh, Ramses and the Hittite king Hattusili III signed peace treaty. The treaty acknowledged that neither side could defeat the other, that the cost of continued conflict exceeded any possible benefit, that borders must be established through negotiation rather than conquest. The treaty rendered Kadesh's ambiguous outcome irrelevant. The battle had resolved nothing, had changed no territorial boundaries, had demonstrated only that both empires were evenly matched and that continued warfare served neither power's interest. But by the time the peace was signed, Kadesh had already become legend, had already been carved into stone across Egypt, had already entered royal narrative as defining moment of Ramses' reign. The treaty could not undo the reliefs, could not change the story that stone had been taught to remember. Kadesh remained victory in Egyptian memory, even as the treaty implicitly acknowledged it had not been victory, remained proof of divine favor, even as the negotiated peace revealed that divine favor required diplomatic pragmatism. In the temple shadows, the reliefs still gleam, testament not to what happened on the banks of the Orontes, but to Ramses' understanding that memory is constructed, that history is narrative, That truth is what persists in stone after those who knew differently have returned to dust. The battle at Kadesh became not what happened but what Ramses proclaimed had happened, and in that proclamation created a truth more durable than fact, the truth that power shapes memory, that kings author their own legends, that the past belongs to those determined enough to carve their version of it into mountains. In the sacred chambers of Abu Simbel, beside the four colossal statues of the king himself, stands something unprecedented in Egypt's long chronicle of monuments, a statue of equal height depicting not a god but a woman. Nefertari, whose name means beautiful companion, was elevated by Ramses to a status no royal wife had claimed before. Her temple stands adjacent to his, their monuments in dialogue across the desert silence, her face carved with the same eternal calm that marks his own. The smaller temple at Abu Simbel, though smaller, is relative term when describing structure with 30-foot statues guarding its entrance, was dedicated jointly to Nefertari and the goddess Hathor. 6 colossal statues front the facade, 4 of Ramses and 2 of Nefertari. The queen stands at same scale as the king, an equality almost never granted in Egyptian royal iconography, where pharaohs towered over wives, children, and subjects. The inscription above the entrance reads, "Ramses II has made a temple excavated in the mountain of eternal workmanship for the chief queen Nefertari Meritmut in Nubia, forever and ever, Nefertari for whose sake the very sun does shine." The poetry is unusual for official inscription. Egyptian royal texts typically employed formal, ritualized language, avoided personal sentiment, maintained proper distance between divine pharaoh and mortal relationships. But the text at Nefertari's temple breaks these conventions, speaks of sun shining for her sake, suggests that cosmic order itself responds to her presence. Whether the sentiment reflected genuine affection or represented political gesture honoring the wife from powerful noble family whose support Ramses needed in early reign cannot be known with certainty. But the monument exists, the equality of scale exists, the poetry exists, all testifying that Nefertari held position of unusual prominence. Inside her tomb in the Valley of the Queen's Tomb, QV 66 paintings survive that are considered among the finest examples of ancient Egyptian art. The colors retain their vibrancy 3,000 years after application. Deep blues derived from lapis lazuli, rich reds from iron oxides, bright yellows from arsenic compounds, blacks from carbon. The paintings show Nefertari in the afterlife, performing rituals, conversing with gods, playing Senet, the ancient board game associated with Journey through the underworld. She moves through these painted chambers with grace captured in every gesture, her face showing features that seem individual rather than idealized, her form showing beauty that transcends the stylized conventions of Egyptian art. The tomb's ceiling is painted with stars, golden five-pointed stars scattered across deep blue background, representing the body of the goddess Nut who swallowed the sun each evening and gave birth to it each morning, the sky goddess whose form arched over the earth protecting the living and the dead. Nefertari moves beneath these stars in eternal ritual, her figure accompanied by hieroglyphic texts from the Book of the Dead, spells and formulas meant to guide her through the challenges of the afterlife, to ensure her transformation from mortal queen to eternal being. Yet Nefertari was one among many. Egyptian royal practice allowed pharaohs multiple wives, a great royal wife, who held highest status, secondary royal wives who enjoyed lesser but still significant position, and numerous consorts and concubines who populated the royal harem. Ramses would take 8 great royal wives across his 6 to 7 year reign. After Nefertari came Isnofret, mother of Ramses' eventual successor Merneptah. Then came daughters of foreign kings, Hittite princesses sent to seal alliances, daughters of vassal rulers offered as tribute and token of loyalty. And Ramses also married several of his own daughters, continuing ancient practice of royal sibling marriage meant to preserve divine bloodline. The proliferation raises question: what did it mean to be beloved of Pharaoh whose love was distributed across dynasties? What status did Nefertari's monuments really convey? The temple at Abu Simbel and tomb in Valley of the Queens might represent genuine affection, or might represent political calculation. Nefertari came from noble family, brought political connections that young Ramses needed, deserved monuments that honored those connections. Or might represent timing. Nefertari was chief queen during peak of Ramses' building program, received monuments simply because monumental building was what Ramses did, would have built such structures for whoever held the position at that moment. Nefertari disappears from historical record after about year 24 of Ramses' reign. No mention of her death. No record of her burial, just absence where her name had been. Isnofret, the second great royal wife, begins appearing in inscriptions in Nefertari's place, suggesting that Nefertari died sometime in midreign, that her decades-long tenure as chief queen ended while Ramses still had 40 years of rule remaining. The monuments she received, the temple, the tomb, were carved and painted while she lived, were completed before her death, were gifts she could witness rather than posthumous honors. In the tomb's painted chambers, Nefertari performs eternal rituals, raises offerings to gods, plays senate with invisible opponents, recites spells that transform her from mortal into something that can survive death's dissolution. The paintings freeze her in perpetual motion, in actions that never complete, in journey that never arrives. The tomb was sealed after her burial, was hidden from tomb robbers, was lost for centuries until Italian archaeologist Ernesto Schiaparelli discovered it in 1904. When the tomb was opened, the painting's colors were so vivid they seemed fresh, seemed to pulse with life, seemed to suggest that Nefertari had only recently departed. But the tomb had also suffered water damage, had been looted in antiquity despite being hidden. The mummy was gone, the sarcophagus shattered, the burial goods stolen. Only the paintings remained, testimony to beauty that outlasted the body it was meant to accompany into eternity. In the 1980s and 1990s, conservators worked to stabilize the paintings, to prevent further deterioration, to preserve what could be preserved. The tomb is now closed to regular tourism, opened only occasionally for small groups, protected from the humidity and carbon dioxide that visitors bring, from the touching and photographing and simple presence of living bodies in space designed for the dead. The paintings show Nefertari with unusual tenderness for official art. Show her beauty preserved not in stilted iconography, but in images that capture something closer to individual presence. Yet the paintings also reveal the limits of what can be known. They show Queen performing rituals but reveal nothing of the woman performing them. Show idealized form but conceal the human being who wore that form. Show eternal presence but hide the mortal life that ended 3,000 years ago, leaving only painted images and carved stone and questions about what it meant to be beloved of Pharaoh, to receive monuments equal in scale to his, to be honored with poetry claiming sun shone for your sake, yet to be forgotten when next wife took your place, when death made room for another to stand beside the king who would outlive most of his wives, most of his children, most of his subjects. Ruling so long that continuity itself became kind of cruelty, that presence became burden, that immortality carved in stone mocked the mortality of everyone around him. In the 19th year of Ramses' reign, after decades of skirmishes and territorial disputes along the contested frontier between Egyptian and Hittite spheres of influence, something unprecedented occurred. The two great powers dividing the ancient Near East between them agreed to peace. Not merely truce, not temporary cessation of hostilities, but formal treaty establishing framework for permanent peace, mutual defense, and diplomatic recognition between empires. The treaty was negotiated through correspondence between Ramses II and Hattusili III, who had become Hittite king after deposing his nephew in what Egyptian records diplomatically refrained from characterizing as coup. The negotiations took years. Required exchanging letters carved in cuneiform and hieroglyphs, required translators who could navigate between languages and diplomatic traditions, required both sides accepting that neither could achieve through warfare what they sought: security of borders, recognition of spheres of influence, cessation of the constant raiding and counter-raiding that drained resources and destabilized frontier regions. The treaty that emerged was inscribed on silver tablets in both Egyptian and Hittite versions. The tablets themselves have not survived. Silver was too valuable to leave intact, was melted down in antiquity for reuse, but copies were preserved. Clay tablets inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform, the diplomatic language of the era, were archived in the Hittite capital of Hattusa. And Egyptian hieroglyphic versions were carved on temple walls at Karnak and the Ramesseum, preserved in stone that could not be melted, that could not be erased, that testified to the treaty's terms across 3,000 years. The treaty's preamble established mutual recognition, named both kings by their full royal titulary, acknowledged each as legitimate ruler of his realm, and declared that the peace was made to make good for eternity the relationship which the sun god and the storm god made for the land of Egypt and the land of Hatti. The invocation of deities was not mere formula, was assertion that the peace had divine sanction, that breaking it would be not merely political violation but religious offense, that the treaty bound not just the kings who made it but their successors and their subjects across generations. The substantive terms addressed practical concerns of two empires with long contested border. Article 1 declared that forever, from this day on, a good peace and a good brotherhood shall exist between Egypt and Hatti. Article 2 established non-aggression pact. Neither side would attack the other, neither would support rebellions against the other, neither would encroach on territories recognized as belonging to the other. Article 3 created defensive alliance. If either kingdom was attacked by third party, the other would provide military assistance. If Ramses faced invasion, Hittite forces would march to Egypt's defense. If enemies threatened Hattusa, Egyptian armies would support Hittite resistance. Article 4 addressed succession disputes, promising that if king died and his heir faced challenges from relatives or nobles seeking throne, the other empire would support the legitimate successor against usurpers. Article 5 concerned fugitives. Criminals, escaped slaves, or political refugees who fled from one empire to the other would be returned, but with stipulation that they would not be punished for fleeing, that their families would not suffer retribution, that return would be conducted with dignity, protecting the fugitive from vengeance. The article revealed sophisticated understanding of diplomatic complexity, that harboring fugitives could create tensions between powers, but that harsh treatment of returned fugitives would make future returns impossible and undermine the treaty's mutual trust. The treaty was unprecedented in scope and formality. Earlier diplomatic arrangements had existed: alliances, marriages, tributary relationships. But no surviving document from the ancient Near East approached the Treaty of Kadesh in its comprehensive vision of peace between equals. The treaty acknowledged that neither empire could defeat the other, accepted that borders must be maintained through agreement rather than conquest, recognized that stability required both sides committing to peace rather than seeking advantage through warfare. Yet the treaty came wrapped in irony. Was negotiated after the Battle of Kadesh, which both sides claimed as victory, which neither side won. Was response to strategic stalemate, to recognition that decades of conflict had resolved nothing, had merely drained resources and lives without changing the fundamental balance of power. Ramses, who had spent his youth proclaiming martial glory, who had covered temples with reliefs celebrating his prowess at Kadesh, now accepted in his middle years the harder wisdom, that military force could not achieve what negotiation could, that the greatest victories are sometimes the wars not fought, that true power lies not in crushing enemies but in transforming them into partners. The peace held. For the remainder of Ramses' reign and beyond, Egypt and Hatti maintained alliance. A correspondence between the royal courts addressed not military matters but diplomatic formalities, gifts exchanged, marriages arranged. 13 years after the treaty, Ramses married a Hittite princess daughter of Hattusili III in ceremony that sealed the alliance in blood as well as ink. The princess took Egyptian name, became one of Ramses' great royal wives, symbolized the peace that had transformed ancient enemies into family. The treaty established procedures that would seem familiar to modern diplomats, created framework for communication between courts, specified protocols for receiving ambassadors, outlined dispute resolution mechanisms, promised cooperation against common enemies. The sophistication suggests that late Bronze Age international relations were more complex than simplified narratives of constant warfare admit. This suggests that empires understood that stability required networks of alliance and mutual recognition, that power was exercised as much through diplomacy as through military force, that the most durable conquests were not territorial expansions but negotiated agreements that served both parties' interests. In temple reliefs at Karnak, the treaty is depicted visually. Ramses and Hattusili meeting in council, scribes recording their words, gods witnessing the oath. The image freezes moment of agreement in eternal present, makes the peace as permanent as stone, transforms diplomatic achievement into sacred covenant. Yet the relief also reveals anxiety beneath the proclamation. Why carve peace treaty on temple walls unless peace required defending, unless the decision to negotiate rather than fight needed justification, unless accepting that warfare had failed required explaining to subjects who had been taught to expect endless triumph. The treaty tablets declared peace would last forever. In fact, the treaty endured about a century. The Hittite Empire collapsed during the Bronze Age upheavals around 1200 BCE, was destroyed by invasions of sea peoples and internal rebellions, dissolved leaving no successor state to honor the treaty's terms. Egypt survived the Bronze Age collapse but emerged weakened, facing its own invasions and internal troubles. The eternal peace lasted only as long as the empires that made it. When those empires fell, the treaty became historical artifact rather than binding agreement, became archaeological curiosity rather than framework for international relations, became text carved in stone testifying not to eternal peace but to the temporal nature of all human arrangements, even those proclaimed eternal. Yet the treaty's significance transcends its limited duration, represents moment when warfare gave way to negotiation. When borders were drawn by diplomats rather than generals, when ancient powers chose stability over expansion, when the young warrior king became statesman. The peace that followed war at Kadesh was Ramses' true victory, not the battle he proclaimed triumph, but the treaty he negotiated in its ambiguous aftermath. The peace that required acknowledging limitation, that demanded accepting what warfare could not achieve. That transformed enemy into ally and stalemate into framework for cooperation that, however briefly, brought stability to contested frontier and demonstrated that the greatest power sometimes lies not in ability to make war but in wisdom to choose peace. In the eastern delta where the Nile branches toward the sea, where marshland met trade routes connecting Egypt to Asia and the Mediterranean world, Ramses built a city that would bear his name and serve as his capital, Pi-Ramesses, domain of Ramses, great in victories. Here, at the crossroads of empire, the pharaoh constructed metropolis meant to project Egyptian power across the known world, to serve as administrative heart of his realm, to be monument not of stone alone but of urban planning and royal ambition. The city's location was strategic, sat in the eastern delta near where the Pelusiac branch of the Nile flowed toward the Mediterranean, controlled routes to Sinai and Canaan, provided access to ports for maritime trade, was positioned to serve military purposes close enough to Syria-Palestine frontier that armies could be mustered and supplied for campaigns northward, distant enough from southern Egypt that it projected power into contested territories rather than defending secure heartland. The city was built for war as much as for commerce, for projection of force as much as for administration. The foundations were laid over the ancient Hyksos capital of Avaris. The Hyksos foreign rulers who had controlled Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period centuries before Ramses had been driven out, but their capital remained, its ruins providing foundation for new construction. There was symbolism in building over Avaris, was claiming foreign soil for Egyptian glory, was transforming site of occupation into seat of Egyptian power, was writing over history of Egypt's vulnerability with proclamation of Egyptian dominance. The city rose on palimpsest, new structures built atop old Egyptian monuments erected where foreign rulers had once held court. Royal inscriptions described Pi-Rameses in language that blurred distinction between actual city and idealized vision. The texts proclaimed it place of abundant waters and fertile fields, of skilled craftsmen and loyal soldiers, of temples whose walls touched heaven. It described the city's 4 quarters, each dedicated to different deity Amun in the west, Seth in the south, Astarte in the east, Wadjet in the north. Listed the city's workshops, bronze foundries, chariot factories, glassworks, textile workshops, ceramic kilns. Enumerated its warehouses, granaries holding surplus from delta harvests, arsenals storing weapons for northern campaigns, treasuries holding tribute from vassal states. The descriptions created vision of perfect city, ordered and prosperous, designed and blessed by gods, manifestation of ideal urban form. But the reality was doubtless more complex. Pi-Rameses sat in humid delta, was built in marshland prone to flooding, struggled with swarms of insects that bred in standing water. The city's military character meant large garrison of soldiers, meant population of craftsmen producing weapons and military equipment, meant transient residents, mercenaries, foreign auxiliaries, prisoners of war pressed into labor. The urban landscape combined monumental architecture with military infrastructure, palaces with barracks, temples with arsenals. The city served less as place where Egyptians lived than as place from which Egyptian power was projected, was command center rather than community, was military installation dressed as capital. Archaeological evidence suggests the city was largest in Egypt at height of Ramses' reign, covered approximately 4 square miles. Population estimates range from 100,000 to 300,000 massive for ancient city, rivaling great urban centers of Mesopotamia and Anatolia. The population included Egyptian administrators and soldiers, foreign merchants and craftsmen, Syrian and Canaanite residents who managed trade networks, Nubian troops serving in military, prisoners and slaves from various campaigns. The city was cosmopolitan by necessity of empire, was place where different peoples and languages mingled, where Egyptian dominance was visible but where Egyptian culture existed alongside foreign influences. The city's temples were numerous and grand. A primary temple was dedicated to Ramses himself as divine pharaoh, served by priests who made offerings to Ramses the God, who maintained cult of royal divinity that blurred line between living king and eternal divine presence. The other temples honored traditional Egyptian deities Amun, Ra, Ta, but also included temples to foreign gods like Astarte and Baal, reflecting the cosmopolitan population and Ramses' understanding that maintaining order in diverse city required acknowledging religious diversity of its inhabitants. The royal palace complex was enormous. The descriptions in texts and evidence from foundation remains suggest palace covering acres, with throne rooms and audience halls, residential quarters for royal family, administrative offices for bureaucrats managing empire's affairs, workshops producing luxury goods for royal use. The palace walls were decorated with glazed tiles showing captive enemies, victories in battle, divine favor bestowed on king. The decoration served political purpose, reminded visitors and residents alike of Pharaoh's power, of Egypt's military might, of divine sanction for royal authority. But Ramses existed as much in propaganda as in physical reality. Royal inscriptions proclaimed its magnificence so insistently that the insistence itself becomes suspicious. Why describe the city's splendor so elaborately unless splendor required describing? Unless reality needed supplementing with rhetoric, unless the actual city struggled to match the ideal city of royal imagination. The texts protest the city's greatness so loudly that the protests suggest anxiety that Ramses perhaps never quite became what Ramses intended, that the vision exceeded the reality, that the city required constant textual reinforcement to maintain its status as glorious capital. After Ramses' death, the city began its slow decline. His successor Merneptah maintained the capital there, as did several subsequent pharaohs, but the Nile was shifting course. The Pelusiac branch that had made Ramses accessible was silting up, was becoming harder to navigate, was transforming from major waterway into sluggish channel. The city's strategic location became liability as trade routes shifted, as military campaigns focused on different frontiers, as Egypt's power waned and maintaining large delta capital became expensive burden. By the 21st dynasty, about 2 centuries after Ramses' death, Ramses was being abandoned. The capital shifted to Tanis, a city in the northeastern delta built largely from materials quarried from Ramses. The columns and obelisks and statues that Ramses had erected were dismantled, transported to Tanis, re-erected in new capital. Ramses was literally cannibalized to build its successor. The temples were stripped of their decoration, the palaces were left to collapse, the workshops fell silent. The population dispersed, following the capital to its new location, leaving behind only ruins that would gradually disappear beneath delta mud. Today, almost nothing remains visible above ground. The site of Ramses is located beneath agricultural fields and modern villages near Cantir. Only excavations reveal the city's plan, uncover foundation remains, discover fragments of the glory that inscriptions proclaimed. The city that Ramses built to eternal fame dissolved back into delta mud, its stones recycled into later monuments, its location debated by scholars, its existence known primarily through texts that described what no longer exists, through inscriptions proclaiming permanence that could not be maintained. The city that rose from desert returned to desert, or rather, to marshland from which it had been reclaimed, leaving only the question: can cities ever truly capture permanence? Can urban monuments outlast the rivers that sustain them, the populations that inhabit them, the empires that build them? Or are all human cities only temporary arrangements of matter against patient dissolution of time, only brief assertions of order against the delta's tendency to reclaim what was taken from it? Only monuments that proclaim eternity while knowing, somewhere beneath the proclamation, that the Nile will shift course, the silt will accumulate, and the city will be forgotten, leaving only fragments buried in mud testifying that here, once, a pharaoh tried to build forever and built instead for 2 centuries. Which seemed like forever at the time, but which time revealed as merely temporary victory against inevitable dissolution. Ramses fathered more than 100 children across his 6 to 7 year reign. The exact number is uncertain, records are incomplete, many children died young and left no trace, some were born to minor consorts whose names were not preserved. But the genealogies that survive list at least 4 to 5 sons and numerous daughters, a proliferation of princes and princesses whose names fill inscriptions with the density of census records. The children came from multiple marriages. Nefertari bore several sons, including Amenhotep, who was designated heir and crown prince. Isnofret bore Ramesses, Kimweset, and Merneptah. The Hittite princess who sealed the peace treaty bore children whose existence bridged former enemies. Various lesser wives and consorts bore dozens more. The family tree became labyrinth, became genealogical complexity requiring careful record-keeping to track which children belonged to which mothers, which had legitimate claim to succession, which held positions in temple or military or administrative bureaucracy. The proliferation served political purposes. Royal sons were appointed to govern provinces, to manage temple estates, to command military units. They became extensions of Pharaoh's authority, his representatives distributed across empire, his agents managing the vast apparatus of Egyptian state. The system allowed Ramses to maintain control across territories too large for single ruler to directly administer. The sons served as governors whose loyalty was guaranteed by blood, whose authority derived from their royal birth, whose interests aligned with crown because their status depended on maintaining the dynasty that gave them power. Royal daughters were married to high officials, cementing alliances between crown and powerful families, creating networks of obligation that bound nobility to throne. Some daughters were married to foreign rulers, becoming diplomats whose bodies sealed treaties, whose children would inherit mixed bloodlines connecting Egypt to vassal states. And some daughters were married to Ramses himself, continuing ancient Egyptian practice of royal sibling marriage, meant to preserve divine bloodline, meant to concentrate power within royal family, meant to ensure that succession remained within narrowly defined group rather than dispersing royal authority across wider kinship network. But Ramses lived so long that he outlived most of his children. The crown prince Amenhotep, designated heir and named in inscriptions as future pharaoh, died in his 50s without ever ascending the throne. So did the second designated heir Ramesses, and the third Khimwaset, and the fourth. Ramses buried son after son, watching his children age and die while he continued ruling, continued building, continued living beyond all reasonable expectation of longevity for ancient person. The succession became macabre procession. As each crown prince died, the title passed to next surviving son. The position of heir apparent became curse rather than blessing, meant waiting for father who never died, meant growing old while still waiting for throne, meant realizing that position of crown prince might be held for decades without ever becoming actual king. By the time Ramses finally died, his successor would be Merneptah, his 13th son, who took throne in his 60s after spending entire life as prince waiting for succession that must have seemed like it would never come. The children who survived Ramses faced different challenge living in shadow of legend. How does one succeed Pharaoh who ruled for 6 to 7 years, who built monuments across Egypt and Nubia, who claimed divine status, who became identified with pharaonic power itself? Merneptah was capable administrator, competent military commander, legitimate heir. But he inherited empire at its apex, could only maintain what Ramses had built, could not expand or exceed what his father had achieved. His reign of approximately 10 years was stable but unspectacular, maintaining the status quo rather than creating new glories. After Merneptah's death, the succession fragmented. Multiple princes and grandsons of Ramses claimed throne, challenged each other's legitimacy, created brief period of dynastic dispute. The empire that Ramses had stabilized descended into uncertainty as his descendants contested the throne he had occupied longer than most of them had lived. The proliferation of children that had served Ramses during his reign became liability after his death. Too many potential heirs, too many claims to legitimacy, too many princes who had waited decades for opportunity to rule and were unwilling to yield to rivals. The family's complexity revealed tension inherent in ancient monarchy. The system required producing many children to ensure succession, to provide heirs if primary heir died, to create redundancy against disease and violence that made child mortality high in ancient world. But producing many children also created succession crises, created competition for throne, created possibility that royal family would fragment into competing factions, each claiming legitimate authority. Ramses' longevity exacerbated the problem by outliving so many sons. He eliminated the clear succession that might have emerged if he had died younger, created situation where his eventual heir was aging man rather than vigorous successor, left dynasty vulnerable to disputes among grandsons and great-grandsons whose relationships to Ramses were complex and whose claims to throne were ambiguous. In inscriptions and reliefs, Ramses' children appear as procession. They march behind him in temple scenes, their names listed in cartouches, their forms shown in miniature beside his colossal figure. The representations emphasize hierarchy. The king towers over his children, who are shown as smaller despite being adults, who serve as visual reminder of Pharaoh's dominance even over his own family, who exist in representations primarily to emphasize his fatherhood, his virility, his ability to produce dynastic continuity. The children appear not as individuals but as collective testimony to royal fertility, as evidence of divine favor manifest in numerous progeny, as proof that the dynasty would continue because the king had generated such abundance of potential heirs. But the inscriptions also preserve individual names. Amenhotep, who died waiting for throne. Akimwasit, who was high priest of Ptah and conducted restoration projects on ancient monuments, who was remembered in later Egyptian tradition as magician and sage. Ramesses, who served as army commander. Merneptah, who finally inherited throne and faced invasions by Libya and sea peoples that tested Egypt's borders. The daughters whose names are less frequently preserved but who appear occasionally in inscriptions as priestesses or royal wives. These individual glimpses suggest that the children were not merely extensions of royal authority, but were people with own lives, own ambitions, own experiences of being children of most powerful ruler in ancient world. What was it like to be son of Ramses, to grow up in shadow of colossal statues bearing father's face, to know that throne might be yours someday if you survived long enough and if enough brothers died before you, to serve as governor or priest or commander while father continued ruling decade after decade after decade? What was it like to be daughter of Ramses, to be married off to seal political alliance, to move to foreign court or to provincial capital, to be used as diplomatic tool to cement father's authority? The inscriptions preserve names but hide experiences. The monuments show forms but conceal persons. The children who inherited empire or who waited to inherit it, or who never inherited it because death came first remain present only in fragments, in lists of names, in brief mentions in texts that focus on their father and treat them as supporting cast in drama where only the king holds center stage. Yet the children's existence shaped Egyptian history. The sons who governed provinces administered empire that Ramses built. The daughters who married foreign rulers created alliances that maintained peace. Merneptah preserved Egypt against external threats even as internal forces were beginning the long decline. The grandsons and great-grandsons, despite succession disputes, maintained dynasty for several more generations before 20th dynasty replaced Ramses' family with new line of rulers. The children's collective impact was maintaining system that Ramses created, preserving for decades what one man had built across lifetime. In this, they succeeded not in matching their father's glory, which was impossible, but in ensuring that his work endured beyond his death, that the empire continued, that the dynasty persisted. This was their inheritance and their achievement, not exceeding Ramses but preserving him, not surpassing his monuments but maintaining them, not creating new legends but serving as bridges between the legendary past and the diminishing future, as generation that inherited the apex and managed the decline, as children who never escaped father's shadow but who accepted the burden of living within it and carrying it forward as long as they could before time's erosion made carrying it impossible. Ramses claimed divine descent with certainty that transcended usual ritual formulas of pharaonic propaganda. He was not merely beloved of gods, but was God himself. Ramses the Great appeared in temple inscriptions alongside Amun and Ra and Ptah, receiving offerings, granting blessings, manifesting divine power through mortal form. The claim was not innovation. Egyptian theology had always held that pharaohs were divine, that kingship itself was divine office, that ruler was incarnation of Horus and son of Ra. But Ramses pursued the claim with unprecedented consistency, carved it into every monument, made it central to his royal identity, insisted on his divinity with such repetition that the repetition itself becomes significant. In temples across Egypt, Ramses appears in relief standing among gods. Not approaching gods as supplicant, not receiving blessings from superior divine beings, but standing as their equal, his figure the same scale as theirs, his titles intertwining with theirs. At Abu Simbel, the sanctuary deep within the mountain temple shows 4 seated statues, Ra-Horakhti, Ramses himself, Amun-Ra, and Ptah. Twice each year, sunlight penetrates the temple's interior to illuminate 3 of these figures, the 2 gods and the deified king between them, leaving Ptah in darkness. The alignment suggests that Ramses occupies space between the solar deity and the creator god, mediating between cosmic forces, himself becoming cosmic principle rather than merely mortal ruler. The theology served multiple purposes. Divine kings cannot be questioned, their authority comes from gods rather than from human arrangements, cannot be challenged without committing sacrilege, cannot fail without contradicting divine will. Divine kings cannot die in ordinary sense. Physical death becomes merely transformation, the god Pharaoh passing from earthly manifestation into eternal presence, the royal Ka continuing beyond bodily dissolution. The theology created continuity between past and future, suggested that Ramses was not merely individual ruler, but was incarnation of eternal divine kingship that had existed since creation and would exist until end of time. But the theology also created practical benefits. Temples to Ramses the Great were built during his lifetime. These were not mortuary temples meant to honor dead pharaoh, but were cult centers where priests made offerings to living king in divine form, where rituals honored not the man who happened to be ruling but the divine principle he embodied. The temples generated revenue, received offerings, controlled agricultural land, collected taxes, functioned as economic institutions supporting priestly bureaucracy. By establishing temples to himself as god, Ramses created economic infrastructure that enhanced royal power while simultaneously providing religious justification for that power. The temple at Abu Simbel was dedicated to Ramses the God. The Ramesseum, his massive mortuary temple on Thebes' west bank, contained sections honoring Ramses in divine form while he still lived. Smaller temples and shrines across Egypt followed the pattern honored Ramses not as builder or patron, but as deity worthy of worship. The priests who served these temples were not merely royal administrators but were religious functionaries performing rituals for divine being, creating situation where distinguishing between civil authority and religious worship became impossible, where serving king and serving gods merged into single act. Yet the insistence on divinity also reveals anxiety. Why proclaim godhood so strenuously unless godhood required proclaiming? Why carve claims of divinity into every available surface unless those claims needed constant reinforcement? Why build temples to yourself unless self-worship required institutional support? The monuments protest Ramses' divinity so loudly that the noise itself becomes question not, is the king divine? But what does it mean that king must announce his divinity with such overwhelming repetition? And traditional Egyptian theology held that Pharaoh was divine, but also held that Pharaoh's divinity was office rather than person, was role rather than individual characteristic. Any legitimate pharaoh was divine by virtue of occupying throne, regardless of personal qualities or achievements. But Ramses transformed this, made his personal divinity central to his royal identity, created cult of Ramses the God that was separate from general cult of kingship, insisted that he specifically was divine rather than that any king was divine. The shift was subtle but significant, transformed impersonal office into personal claim, made divinity about Ramses rather than about pharaonic institution. It created theology that could not survive his death because it was theology of individual rather than theology of office. The gods Ramses claimed to embody were traditional Egyptian deities: Ra the sun god, Amun the hidden one, Ta the creator, Horus the falcon. But Ramses also synthesized these deities, created composite divine identity that combined attributes from multiple gods. He was Ramses Belavedoff Amun, Ramses Koznov Ra, Ramsesonoff Ta. The compound names suggested that Ramses was not merely favored by gods but partook of their essence, that divine power flowed through him, that he mediated between gods and humans precisely because he was both god and human, both divine principle and earthly ruler. The theology created paradox. If Ramses was divine, then his failures became theological problems rather than merely political problems. If God Pharaoh commanded victory at Kadesh, yet battle ended in stalemate, what did that reveal about divine power? If God Pharaoh proclaimed eternal peace, yet peace lasted only as long as empires that made it, what did that reveal about eternity? If God Pharaoh built city meant to last forever, yet city was abandoned 2 centuries after his death, what did that reveal about forever? The claims of divinity raised stakes for royal achievement, made every failure not merely human error but cosmic anomaly, made every limitation not merely practical constraint but theological crisis. Yet the theology succeeded. Ramses was worshipped as god during his lifetime and for centuries after his death. Temples continued making offerings to Ramses the god long after Ramses II had died. His cult persisted through dynasties that followed, through periods of Egyptian decline and foreign occupation, through transformations of religious practice. Later Egyptians invoked Ramses the Great as exemplar of pharaonic power, as ideal against which subsequent kings were measured, as figure whose divine status was accepted even by those who understood that his humanity had been limited by same mortality that limits all humans. The gods who blessed Ramses' reign were ultimately gods he created, gods who looked like him, who acted through him, who existed primarily in temples proclaiming their existence. Whether those gods were real in any sense beyond social and political construction cannot be answered. What can be said is that the gods served Ramses' purposes, justified his authority, sanctified his monuments, transformed personal ambition into cosmic necessity. And in doing so, those gods revealed something about the relationship between religion and power, between divinity and propaganda, between what is worshipped because it is sacred and what is called sacred because it is useful to worship it. The gods blessed Ramses, or Ramses blessed himself through gods of his own making. The distinction dissolves in temple shadows where stone statues gaze with divine and human eyes, where inscriptions proclaim divinity with such insistence that insistence itself becomes the proof, where the question of belief yields to the certainty of stone carved to last forever, proclaiming truths that stone cannot verify but that stone's persistence makes difficult to deny. In the valley called Deir el-Medina, tucked into narrow ravine on Thebes' western bank, lived the workers who transformed Ramses' ambitions into stone reality. These were not slaves, Egyptian mythology notwithstanding. The great monuments were not built by enslaved masses but by skilled artisans receiving regular compensation. The workers of Deir el-Medina were stone carvers and painters, plasterers and copper workers, scribes and foremen, specialists whose crafts required years of training and whose labor created the tombs and temples that have defined Egyptian civilization in modern imagination. The village was planned community established by state to house workers constructing royal tombs in Valley of Kings. About 70 houses lined narrow streets, each house containing courtyard, living quarters, storage rooms, family shrine. The houses were modest but substantial mud brick construction, flat roofs serving as additional living space, walls plastered and sometimes painted. The workers lived with their families, raised children who would often follow fathers into same professions, created community that persisted across generations. The workers were paid in kind rather than in currency. Every month they received rations of grain and beer, the staples of Egyptian diet. They also received oil, meat, fish, vegetables, cloth, wood, pottery, everything needed to sustain household. The rations were calculated carefully, allocated based on position and family size, distributed by state officials who maintained detailed records of what was owed and what was delivered. The payment system was bureaucratic but functional, created economic stability that allowed workers to focus on skilled labor rather than on subsistence farming. Their work was specialized and demanding. Stone carvers would descend into Valley of Kings, into tombs being excavated for pharaohs and high officials, would spend hours in underground chambers cutting reliefs into limestone walls, creating images so precise that 3,000 years later the craftsmanship remains evident. Painters would follow the carvers, applying pigments in layers that created rich colors and subtle gradations, mixing mineral compounds to achieve specific hues, working by lamplight in tunnels where natural illumination never reached. The work was also dangerous. The tombs extended deep into bedrock, descended through passages and chambers that could collapse if improperly excavated. Workers breathed dust from stone cutting, inhaled fumes from oil lamps burning in enclosed spaces, suffered injuries from tools and falling rocks. Medical papyri from period describe treatments for worker injuries, broken bones, cuts and lacerations, eye problems from dust exposure, respiratory ailments from poor ventilation. The workers accepted these dangers as part of their profession, as price of specialized skill that gave them secure employment and higher status than agricultural laborers. For the construction of Ramses' monuments, his mortuary temple, the Ramesseum, his additions to Karnak and Luxor temples, the rock-cut temples at Abu Simbel, workers were conscripted from across Egypt. The state corvée labor system required able-bodied men to work on royal projects for specified period each year, serving as temporary labor force supplementing skilled specialists. The conscripts did heavy work quarrying stone, transporting blocks, preparing construction sites. The specialists did precision work carving reliefs, painting murals, fitting stones, creating finished surfaces that transformed raw material into sacred architecture. The workers went on strike during Ramses' 29th year. Their grain rations arrived late, leaving them unable to feed families, unable to purchase other necessities that grain served as currency to acquire. They laid down tools, marched to administrative offices, sat in protest until their demands were met. The strike is recorded in contemporary documents, ostraca and papyri describing the confrontation, the workers' speeches to officials, the negotiations that eventually resulted in rations being delivered and work resuming. The strike is perhaps the first recorded labor action in history. It reveals that even divine kingship operated within practical constraints, that even pharaohs must negotiate with those who actually perform the labor of monumental building. The workers understood their value, knew that specialized skills gave them leverage, that projects could not be completed without their cooperation, that threatening to stop work could pressure state to honor its obligations. The strike succeeded because workers were not easily replaceable, because the state needed their skills more than they individually needed any specific job, because collective action created power that individual workers lacked. The strike also reveals gap between official representations and social reality. Reliefs show monuments rising through divine will or Pharaoh's command, show colossal statues appearing as if gods had willed them into existence. But the reality was more mundane. Monuments required coordinated labor by skilled workers receiving regular wages, required state apparatus managing logistics and supplies, required economic infrastructure supporting thousands of laborers across decades-long projects. The divine images carved into temple walls were created by mortal hands concerned with mundane matters like whether grain rations arrived on time. In their leisure time, the workers created their own art. Ostraca limestone flakes and pottery shards used for informal writing and drawing preserve sketches and doodles. Caricatures of officials, erotic drawings, practice sketches for planned reliefs, images of daily life in village. These informal artworks show different side of workers' skill, work done for own pleasure rather than for royal commission, images reflecting workers' concerns and humor rather than pharaonic propaganda. The ostraca humanize the workers, show them as people with individual personalities and interests rather than as anonymous craftsmen serving only to fulfill royal vision. The village's ruins also preserve thousands of written documents, letters, accounts, legal texts, oracles, prayers, complaints. A worker writes to his son studying to be scribe, urging him to remain in school despite difficulties. A woman complains about noisy neighbor. A priest records oracle's decision in property dispute. A foreman calculates how much copper each worker will need for next month's work. The documents reveal ordinary life proceeding alongside extraordinary labor, show people negotiating personal relationships and economic transactions while also creating monuments meant to last forever. One text records workers' absence, he was ill. Another, his daughter was ill. Another, he was scorpioned, bitten by scorpion. The brief notations in administrative records preserve human vulnerability, show workers suffering ailments and injuries, taking time to care for sick family members, dealing with same health crises that affect all human communities. The absences remind us that monuments were built by people who aged and sickened and died, who had families requiring care, who could not always work because mortal bodies have limits that stone monuments transcend. The workers knew their work would outlast them. They understood that temples and tombs they carved would persist for millennia while they themselves would die within decades. But they signed their work subtly in hidden corners, in barely visible inscriptions, in scratched messages that modern archaeologists find when examining monuments closely. Worker Knack made this, painted by Ka, brief assertions of individual identity in projects that officially credited only Pharaoh. These signatures suggest workers' awareness that they, not the king, actually created the monuments, that royal commissioning was different from physical making, that distinction between who ordered work and who performed work mattered even if official representations elided that distinction. In Deir el-Medina's ruins, archaeologists find not just tools and texts but glimpses of community. Shrines where workers worshipped, ovens where they baked bread, areas where children played, walls where they painted images of protector deities. The village was not just dormitory for labor force but was home, was place where lives were lived fully, where celebrations and funerals occurred, where children were born and elderly died, where the mundane and the extraordinary existed side by side, workers returning from creating eternal monuments to find dinner waiting, to greet families, to live ordinary lives that monuments were meant to transcend, but that made creating monuments possible. The workers who carved eternity lived in time. Their days were measured not in dynasties but in wages earned and bread consumed. Their achievement was not the immortality monuments proclaimed, but the craft that made proclamation possible, not the divine kingship inscriptions celebrated, but the manual skill that transformed royal vision into physical reality. Their portion of immortality is not the monuments themselves, those are credited to Pharaoh, but the fragments of their lives preserved in discarded ostraca and administrative papyri, in informal art and practical texts, in ruins of village where they lived and worked, in the survival of their names scratched into hidden corners where stone testifies that here once, human hands created what was meant to last forever, and those hands belonged to people who knew their work would survive them. Who carved eternity while living mortal lives, who built forever while existing in time, who created monuments to another's glory while creating, inadvertently, monuments to their own forgotten skill. In 1881, in cliffside cache near Deir el-Bahari on Thebes' western bank, local man named Ahmed Abd el-Rushal discovered what would become one of most significant archaeological finds of the century, a hidden chamber containing mummies of numerous pharaohs secretly reburied by priests in antiquity to protect them from tomb robbers. For years, Abd el-Rushal kept the discovery secret, gradually selling artifacts from the cache to antiquities dealers. But authorities eventually investigated the source of objects appearing on black market, pressured Abd el-Rushal family, and one brother finally revealed the cache's location. Among the mummies recovered was Ramses II. His body had been moved from its original tomb in Valley of Kings, had been hidden away centuries after his death when priests concluded that protecting royal mummies from plunder required relocating them to secret location. The mummy was wrapped in linen, bore brief inscription identifying it. Osiris, King Ramses II. Inside the wrappings, preserved with remarkable clarity despite 3,000 years of time's passage, was the body of man who had ruled Egypt for 6 to 7 years. The mummy shows old man, shows someone who died in his 90s, ancient age for any era but especially remarkable for ancient world where life expectancy was perhaps 40 years for those who survived childhood. The face is well preserved, features still recognizable, hawk-like nose prominent, jaw strong, expression serene or impassive depending on light and observer's interpretation. The hair is white with reddish tint, suggesting Ramses may have been red-haired or that hair color changed with preservation processes and time. The body shows effects of advanced age, arthritis in spine and hips, dental disease and abscesses that must have caused significant pain, slight curvature of spine suggesting ankylosing spondylitis. Scientific examination revealed details the king could not have known about himself, details that make him seem more human and less divine. Evidence of battle wounds healed during life, possible fractured bones from military service, scarring suggesting serious injuries survived. Signs of extensive dental problems, abscesses, worn teeth, periodontal disease that would have been painful and debilitating. Indications of arthritis affecting multiple joints, making movement difficult in his later years. Possible evidence of tuberculosis or other respiratory conditions. The God King, who proclaimed divine invulnerability, had suffered very mortal afflictions, had experienced pain and illness, had aged like any other human despite divine claims. In 1976, conservators noticed fungal infection threatening mummy's preservation. The decision was made to transport Ramses to Paris for treatment using modern conservation techniques unavailable in Egypt. The mummy was issued Egyptian passport listing occupation as king deceased, was transported by airplane receiving full state honors as visiting head of state, was received at Le Bourget Airport with military ceremony usually reserved for foreign dignitaries. The gesture was absurd and strangely fitting, treating ancient corpse as if temporal authority survived death, as if Ramses remained somehow sovereign despite 3 millennia of dissolution. In Paris, specialists examined the mummy using techniques including radiography, microscopy, analysis of preservation materials. They treated the fungal infection, stabilized the remains, documented every detail of Ramses' physical condition. The examination produced volumes of scientific data, transformed the God King into medical specimen, reduced eternal presence to collection of pathologies and preservation challenges. Yet the examination also fulfilled Ramses' ambition to be remembered, to remain present, to persist across time in more than memory or monument. The mummy was returned to Egypt after treatment, was placed in Cairo Museum where it remains displayed behind Climatech-controlled glass. Visitors come to see not stone statues but actual flesh that once animated the imperial vision, mortal remains of man who claimed divinity and achieved instead what might be more significant material persistence across time's erosion. The body that commanded armies, that signed treaties, that fathered 100 children, that lived longer than almost anyone in ancient world, remains viewable, remains present in ways that monuments cannot quite achieve. But the display also raises questions. Is exhibiting Ramses' body honoring his memory or violating his rest? The mummy was prepared for afterlife, was meant to house the Ka's spiritual essence that would animate it in eternal realm beyond death. Egyptian theology held that preserving body was essential for afterlife existence, that mummy must remain intact for deceased to survive in other world. Displaying the body for tourists who photograph it, who stare at it through glass, who treat it as curiosity rather than as sacred object, contradicts original intent even as it fulfills Ramses' desire to be remembered. The mummy's face has become icon, has been photographed countless times, analyzed by scholars, depicted in documentaries and books, reproduced in illustrations explaining mummification techniques. The face is more famous now than it was in antiquity. More people have seen Ramses' actual features preserved in his mummy than ever saw him alive. The preservation that was meant to serve religious purpose now serves scientific and cultural purpose. The body that was prepared for afterlife now serves modern interest in ancient Egypt. The king who proclaimed divinity now exists as artifact illuminating historical period rather than as divine being commanding worship. Yet the mummy also reveals triumph of Egyptian preservation techniques. That body could survive 3,000 years, could remain recognizable across millennia, testifies to skill of ancient embalmers. The process involved removing internal organs, treating body with natron to desiccate tissues, applying resins and unguents, wrapping in layers of linen. The procedures were perfected over centuries, were religious ritual as much as preservation technique, were intended to prepare deceased for journey through underworld and eventual resurrection in paradise where they would live eternally. Ramses' mummy demonstrates that at least one aspect of Egyptian afterlife beliefs was achieved. The body did persist, did survive death, did remain present in material form. The Ka may have departed, the spiritual essences may have dispersed, the divine presence may have dissolved, but the physical form survived, and in surviving fulfilled the fundamental hope underlying mummification, that something of the person would endure, that total dissolution could be prevented, that some material connection to mortal existence would persist even as that existence transformed into whatever came after. In Cairo Museum, Ramses rests in climate-controlled case. The lighting is dim to prevent deterioration. The temperature and humidity are carefully regulated. Guards ensure visitors maintain proper distance. The body that once walked through palace corridors, that stood on battlefields, that signed treaties and begot children, that lived 90-something years in world where such longevity was nearly impossible, lies still in glass case, testament to preservation and impermanence, both preserved in flesh but imprisoned in death, present but absent, viewable but unreachable, recognizable but unknowable. The king who wanted to be remembered forever, achieving that goal in way he never anticipated. Not through monuments that proclaim his glory, but through body that reveals his mortality. Not through divine claims that transcend human limitation, but through human remains that demonstrate all the ways he was limited. Not through eternal presence, but through material persistence that makes his mortality undeniable, even as it makes his memory impossible to forget. Ramses ruled for 6 to 7 years longer than most of his subjects lived, longer than most dynasties endured, long enough that the Egypt he left at death was fundamentally different from Egypt he had inherited. He transformed the landscape with monuments, filled genealogies with children, expanded bureaucracy, negotiated peace, proclaimed divinity with such insistence that divine claim became indistinguishable from political reality. His reign became its own epoch, period so extended that continuity itself became defining characteristic, that persistence became achievement distinct from any specific accomplishment. But after his death in 1213 BCE, Egypt began its long decline, not immediately, not catastrophically, but gradually, inexorably, in ways that became clear only with hindsight. His immediate successor Merneptah maintained empire's coherence, defended borders against invasions by Libyans and Sea Peoples, mysterious raiders who attacked eastern Mediterranean civilizations in final decades of Bronze Age. But Merneptah ruled only 10 years before dying, was already elderly when he inherited throne, could only maintain rather than expand what Ramses had built. After Merneptah, succession disputes fragmented royal authority. Multiple claimants to throne emerged from Ramses' proliferation of descendants, each arguing for legitimacy through different mothers, different positions in complex hierarchy of royal wives and sons. The disputes were resolved eventually, but they revealed vulnerability that Ramses' longevity had created succession problem by leaving no clear, young, vigorous heir, that his dynasty's future was uncertain despite his having fathered 100 children. The Sea Peoples continued their raids, attacking Egyptian territories in Levant, disrupting trade networks, creating instability along frontiers. Egypt repelled these attacks but at significant cost, draining resources, requiring constant military mobilization, preventing the economic prosperity that Ramses' peace treaty with Hittites had made possible. The Hittite Empire, Egypt's former rival and later ally, collapsed entirely around 1200 BCE, destroyed by combination of Sea Peoples' invasions, internal rebellions, and mysterious catastrophes that historians still debate. The collapse removed major power from international system, destabilized entire region, eliminated the diplomatic partner that had helped maintain Bronze Age order. Egypt's economy struggled under weight of monumental building programs. Ramses had built more extensively than any previous pharaoh, had employed thousands of workers, had diverted significant resources to temples and tombs and cities. The projects created impressive monuments but also created economic burden. After Ramses' death, subsequent pharaohs could not maintain the same level of construction, could not afford to continue building at scale Ramses had achieved, found that available resources were insufficient for both maintaining empire's defenses and continuing monumental architecture. Ramses the Great capital Ramses built in eastern Delta began its decline. The Nile was shifting course, Pelusiac branch that had made the city accessible was silting up, trade routes were moving elsewhere. Within 2 centuries, the city would be abandoned, its monuments dismantled to build new capital at Tanis. The city that was meant to project power forever lasted barely longer than dynasty that built it. Inflation affected Egyptian economy. As wealth from foreign conquests diminished, as trade networks disrupted by Bronze Age upheavals failed to deliver previous levels of luxury goods and resources, the value of goods and labor shifted. Grain prices rose. Workers' wages calculated in grain rations became insufficient. Temples that owned agricultural land prospered while state struggled to maintain administrative apparatus. Economic power shifted from crown to priesthood, weakening pharaonic authority even as religious institutions grew wealthier. The New Kingdom, that period of Egyptian history marked by imperial expansion and cultural florescence, by 18th dynasty's conquests and 19th dynasty's consolidation under Ramses, entered twilight. The 20th dynasty maintained appearances but could not recapture earlier glory. Foreign peoples settled in Egypt's territories, sometimes peacefully as migrants, sometimes through conquest. Egypt lost control of Nubia, lost territories in Levant, lost the empire that Ramses had maintained. The nation that had been great power dominating Eastern Mediterranean became increasingly regional power defending its own core territories. By 1070 BCE, about a century and a half after Ramses' death, New Kingdom ended entirely. Egypt fragmented into competing kingdoms, priests ruling from Thebes in south, pharaohs ruling from Tanis in north, both claiming legitimate authority, neither able to unify country. The fragmentation would characterize Egyptian politics for centuries. Egypt would be reunified periodically but would never recapture sustained power and stability of New Kingdom. Would be conquered by Kushites from south, by Assyrians from east, by Persians, by Greeks, by Romans. Would become province of foreign empires rather than empire itself. Ramses marked not Egypt's ascent but its apex, the moment of greatest extension before contraction began, the final flourishing before long decline, the last pharaoh who could credibly claim to rule vast empire and make that claim reality. His monuments testify not to what endured but to what was lost, the confidence that such monuments could preserve not merely memory but power, the belief that carving achievement into stone could arrest inevitable dissolution of all human arrangements, the hope that greatness achieved could be maintained indefinitely through will and effort and divine favor. In Valley of Kings, Ramses' tomb was robbed in antiquity despite elaborate precautions. The treasures buried with him were stolen, the sarcophagus was vandalized, the mummy was moved by priests to hidden cache to protect it from further violation. In Abu Simbel, the colossal statues gazed over emptying territories, over Egypt losing Nubia, over the very lands where temple proclaimed Egyptian dominance becoming independent kingdoms or falling under foreign control. The Ramesseum, the great mortuary temple, gradually deteriorated, was quarried for building materials, had its columns toppled and statues broken, became the ruined site that inspired Shelley's Ozymandias poem about vanished glory, about mighty works reduced to fragments in desert, about prideful proclamation outlasting only as ironic reminder of impermanence. The silence that followed Ramses' glory was not absolute silence. Egypt continued existing, Egyptians continued living, pharaohs continued ruling. But the particular configuration of power and prosperity and confidence that characterized Ramses' reign never returned. It could not be replicated because circumstances that enabled it the recovered stability after Amarna period disruptions, the military strength that allowed defending extensive borders, the diplomatic framework that maintained peace with Hittites, the economic resources that supported monumental building. Those circumstances proved temporary, were specific to moment in time, could not be preserved through sheer will even by Pharaoh who claimed divine authority. The monuments Ramses built still stand, testimony to achievement but also to its limits. They survived him, survived his successors, survived dynasties that followed, survived even Egypt's independence, persisting through millennia of foreign rule, through transformation of Egypt from pharaonic kingdom to Roman province to Islamic caliphate to modern nation-state. But they survived as ruins, as fragments of former glory, as evidence of what was built and what could not be sustained. The stone faces at Abu Simbel gaze across desert that has buried the empire they were meant to celebrate. The temples testify to religious system that no longer exists. The inscriptions proclaim victories in wars that are forgotten by everyone except historians. The monuments persist, but context that gave them meaning has dissolved. In the silence that followed glory, Ramses' reign became legend, became the standard against which subsequent pharaohs were measured and found wanting. Became the great, the exemplar, the king whose achievements seemed superhuman precisely because they could not be repeated. The legend obscures the reality that Ramses was product of his time, that his achievements were made possible by circumstances beyond his control, that his greatness consisted partly in being present during Egypt's final period of genuine imperial power. But the legend also reveals truth that what he built mattered, that decisions he made shaped Egyptian history, that his determination to be remembered succeeded beyond anything he could have imagined, that the silence that followed his glory makes the glory itself seem more significant, makes the 7 to 7 years of rule seem more remarkable, makes the monuments seem more impressive because we know now what Ramses could not have known. That everything he built was already beginning to dissolve, that the glory was temporary, that the silence was coming, that the persistence of stone monuments would contrast sharply with the dissolution of power and empire and confidence they proclaimed. Beyond Egypt's borders, in archives of other ancient powers, in texts written by peoples who did not worship Egyptian gods or accept pharaonic authority, traces of Ramses appear in foreign records that knew him not as divine being but as powerful neighbor, rival king, potential threat, or potential ally. These foreign perspectives reveal different Ramses, not god-king carved in stone, but pragmatic ruler navigating complex international politics, not figure of legend but participant in diplomatic and military conflicts that shaped late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean. The Hittite archives are most extensive foreign source. Clay tablets inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform diplomatic language of ancient Near East preserve correspondence between Egyptian and Hittite courts. The tablets record treaty negotiations between Ramses and Hattusili III, document exchange of letters discussing treaties' implementation, preserve diplomatic protocol establishing how the two powers would conduct relations. The Hittite records present Ramses as peer another king whose authority was recognized, whose power required respect, whose kingdom was rival but not enemy once peace was established. One Hittite letter records Hattusili III complaining to Ramses about Egyptian negligence in returning fugitives as treaty required. Another records Hittite king requesting Egyptian physician to treat his sister's illness, demonstrating both medical reputation of Egyptian healers and diplomatic courtesy maintained between courts. Another records arrangements for Hittite princess to marry Ramses, detailing her journey to Egypt, specifying protocol for receiving her, demonstrating how royal marriages sealed political alliances. The letters are businesslike, concerned with practical matters, treating international relations as negotiable arrangements between powers rather than as divine drama between earthly gods. And to Hittites, Ramses was not god but was great king, title reserved for rulers of major powers who controlled extensive territories and numerous vassals. The title acknowledged Ramses' authority without accepting his divine status, recognized Egyptian power without endorsing Egyptian ideology. The Hittite view of Ramses was strategic. He was forced to be negotiated with, power whose interests must be accommodated, ruler whose cooperation was valuable but whose enmity would be dangerous. The pragmatic assessment contrasted sharply with Egyptian representations showing Ramses as divine warrior crushing all opposition, suggesting that foreign powers recognized Egyptian strength while understanding its limits. Biblical texts have generated debate about possible connection to Ramses. Book of Exodus describes unnamed Pharaoh who enslaved Hebrews, who resisted Moses' demands for their release, who pursued fleeing Israelites to Red Sea where Egyptian army drowned. Some scholars have proposed identifying this pharaoh with Ramses II, noting that Exodus mentions Israelites building cities, including city called Ramesses, possibly Pi-Rameses. Others argue that Exodus narrative is legendary rather than historical, or that if historical then events described occurred during different pharaohs' reign. Archaeological evidence neither confirms nor refutes connection. No Egyptian records mention Israelite enslavement or exodus. No evidence exists for massive departure of enslaved population. No traces of wandering Israelites appear in Sinai archaeological record. But the debate reveals how Ramses entered religious consciousness of peoples beyond Egypt's borders. Whether or not he was pharaoh of Exodus, he became identified in later Jewish and Christian tradition as representing tyrannical power that God opposed, as embodiment of oppression from which God delivered Israel. The identification transformed Ramses from Egyptian king into theological symbol, made him represent not merely historical figure but principle of worldly power that resists divine will. The transformation demonstrates how foreign peoples incorporated Egyptian history into own religious narratives, how Ramses became figure in dramas not his own, how his legacy escaped his control and became available for reinterpretation by cultures that rejected everything he represented. Greek historians writing centuries after Ramses confused him with other pharaohs, created composite figures that mingled fact with legend. Herodotus, visiting Egypt in 5th century BCE, heard stories about pharaohs but could not always distinguish one from another, created narratives that combined features from multiple reigns. Diodorus Siculus, writing in 1st century BCE, described Pharaoh he called Ozymandias, Greek rendering of one of Ramses' throne names, and attributed to him monuments and achievements that became legendary. The Greek accounts demonstrate both foreign fascination with Egyptian civilization and foreign inability to fully comprehend Egyptian history, created simplified narratives that made Egypt comprehensible to Greek audiences but that sacrificed historical accuracy for narrative coherence. The Greek perception of Ramses as Ozymandias inspired Shelley's famous poem, "Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." The poem imagines vast ruined statue in desert, proclaiming Pharaoh's power while surrounded by emptiness, testifying ironically to impermanence of human achievement. Shelley likely never knew about actual Ramses, was responding to Greek legends and to travelers' accounts of Egyptian ruins, was using Ozymandias as symbol for vanished glory rather than as historical figure. But the poem demonstrates how Ramses entered Western imagination as embodiment of hubris, as example of power's transience, as reminder that even mighty works crumble and nothing beside remains. Roman writers described Egypt as ancient land filled with mysterious monuments built by forgotten kings. They visited Egyptian sites as tourists, marveled at colossal statues and massive temples, tried to decipher hieroglyphs they could not read, created explanations for monuments based on imagination rather than knowledge. To Romans, Ramses' monuments were already incomprehensibly ancient, were testimony to civilization that had flourished and declined centuries before Rome existed. The Roman perspective demonstrates how quickly Ramses passed from living memory to legend to archaeological mystery, how monuments outlasted cultural memory of who built them and why. Islamic historians of medieval period recorded Egyptian monuments and attempted to reconstruct their history based on local traditions and partial understanding of hieroglyphic inscriptions. Arab writers described pharaoh statues and attempted explanations for who had built them. Some attributed monuments to biblical figures, some to mythical kings, some to mysterious ancient peoples whose true identity was unknown. The Islamic accounts demonstrate continuity of Egyptian monuments as objects of wonder and speculation, as structures so massive they demanded explanation even when accurate historical knowledge was unavailable. Foreign perspectives reveal that Ramses' authority extended only as far as Egyptian borders, that beyond Nile Valley his power was negotiable rather than absolute, that God-King was constrained by same political and military realities limiting all rulers. The Hittites negotiated with him as pure biblical tradition made him villain, Greeks confused him with other pharaohs, Romans viewed his monuments as ancient mysteries, Islamic scholars speculated about his identity. None accepted Egyptian ideology presenting him as divine being whose authority was cosmic rather than political. All treated him as historical figure, powerful certainly but human nonetheless, king whose achievements were impressive but whose divinity was Egyptian claim rather than universal truth. The foreign texts show Ramses not in triumph but in pragmatic diplomacy, not issuing divine commands but making strategic compromises, not commanding universal recognition but managing limited sphere of influence bounded by other powers with own interests and own divine kings. The contrast between how Ramses represented himself in Egyptian monuments and how foreign powers perceived him reveals gap between propaganda and politics, between eternal presence monuments proclaimed and temporal authority foreign archives recorded, between what Ramses wanted to be and what he actually was, not god but king, not eternal presence but mortal ruler. Not cosmic force but political actor navigating complex international system where his power was real but was also limited, where his achievements mattered but were also constrained by circumstances beyond his control, where his fame would spread far beyond Egypt's borders but would be transformed in spreading, would become available for foreign interpretation and foreign use, would escape his authorship and become figures in narratives he never imagined, serving purposes he never intended, representing principles he never endorsed, achieving persistence he desired, but achieving it in ways that denied everything he had claimed about himself. In the quiet corridors of Abu Simbel, in the shadowed chambers of the Ramesseum, in the crumbling foundations of Pi Ramesses buried beneath delta mud, in the face of the mummy behind climate-controlled glass, a question whispers through 3,000 years of silence. What drove this man to build so relentlessly, to proclaim so insistently, to claim divinity so loudly that even death seems insufficient to silence the proclamation? Was it vision or was it fear? Was it confidence or was it desperate attempt to arrest time's dissolution through permanence of stone? The monuments offer no answer. They proclaim achievement but not motivation, celebrate triumph but not doubt, show divine certainty but not human questioning. Ramses left no private journals, no confessions, no moments of unguarded reflection. He exists only in official representations, only in idealized forms that power requires, only in public face that reveals nothing of whatever private anxieties or uncertainties might have existed beneath golden regalia and divine claims. Yet the very scale of his monuments suggests something beyond mere political propaganda. Stone statues 60 feet high, temples carved into mountains, peace treaty inscribed on temple walls, cities built and named for himself, hundreds of children fathered, 6 to 7 years ruling with such determination that longevity itself became achievement. Such insistence implies not confidence but need, not certainty but attempt to create certainty through endless repetition. What fear hides beneath such overwhelming assertion? What mortality haunts such extreme claims of immortality? Perhaps the fear was of being forgotten, of being one more pharaoh in long line of pharaohs, indistinguishable from predecessors and successors, ruling and dying and leaving nothing that would persist. Perhaps Ramses understood that memory is constructed, that without monuments there would be no remembering, that stone is necessary because human memory fails, because time erases, because everything mortal dissolves unless anchored in something more permanent than flesh or even than oral tradition. Perhaps the monuments were insurance against oblivion, guarantee that however much else was forgotten, his name would persist carved into rock too massive to ignore. Perhaps the fear was of human limitation, of being merely mortal despite royal pretensions, of aging and weakening and dying like everyone else, of facing same dissolution that awaits all living things regardless of status or power or achievement. Perhaps claiming divinity was defense against mortality. If he was God, then death would be transformation rather than ending, persistence rather than dissolution, continuation rather than cessation. Perhaps the divine claims were not cynical propaganda but desperate faith, attempt to believe that he would survive death, that the Ka would persist, that something of Ramses would exist beyond the moment when heart stopped beating. Perhaps the fear was of meaninglessness, of ruling for decades without accomplishing anything that mattered, of exercising power without purpose, of building nothing that would justify the suffering required to build it. Perhaps monuments were an attempt to create meaning, to transform political authority into legacy, to make rule matter beyond immediate tactical victories and administrative efficiency, to ensure that time spent governing left mark on world rather than dissolving into forgotten past moment rule ended. Perhaps Ramses needed monuments not because he was confident of significance but because he doubted it, needed visible proof that his reign meant something, needed stone testament because intangible achievements seemed insufficient. Or perhaps there was no fear. Perhaps Ramses was simply ambitious in ways that transcended rational calculation, simply wanted to build because building was what pharaohs did, simply enjoyed seeing monuments rise bearing his name and image, simply took satisfaction in transforming vision into reality regardless of whether vision was driven by fear or faith or something more complex than either. Perhaps the relentless building was not compensation for doubt but expression of confidence that he could command resources necessary, confidence that workers would do what he demanded, confidence that stone would persist, confidence that he deserved monuments as tribute to achievements that were real even if also exaggerated. The question cannot be answered because Ramses is not available for interrogation. It cannot explain what drove him because explanations were not carved into monuments, were not preserved in texts that survived, exist only in silences between what was built and what remains. Modern observers bring own anxieties and assumptions to interpretation, project own concerns onto ancient figure who cannot confirm or correct the projections. Some see tyrant obsessed with legacy. Some see visionary transforming kingdom. Some see insecure man compensating through monumentality. Some see confident ruler expressing power through architecture. All interpretations are speculative because the evidence is monuments that proclaim but do not explain, that show what was done but hide why it was done. Yet the question matters precisely because it cannot be answered. It matters because it forces confronting mystery at heart of monuments, that massive physical presence does not necessarily translate into emotional or psychological transparency, that we can document what Ramses built without understanding why he built it, that achievement can be visible while motivation remains opaque. The question matters because it reminds that even figures who leave extensive material traces remain ultimately unknowable, that stone preserves forms but not intentions, that monuments testify to power but not to the human complexities that wielded that power. The question also matters because it applies beyond Ramses, applies to all who build monuments, all who seek to be remembered, all who attempt to arrest time's erosion through creating something meant to persist. What drives humans to build? And to create works that will outlast them, to insist that they mattered, that their existence had meaning, that something of them will survive death's dissolution. The question haunts every monument ever built, every pyramid and temple and cathedral and memorial, every structure raised with intention of persistence, every human attempt to deny oblivion through architecture or art or any form of creation meant to outlast creator. In desert silence, Ramses' monuments stand. Four colossal faces at Abu Simbel gaze across emptiness, scattered ruins of Ramesseum mark where great temple once rose, fragments of statues lie in museums labeled with his cartouche. Mummy rests behind glass bearing his features, inscriptions carved across Egypt proclaim his glory, children study his name in history books. Tourists visit his monuments, scholars analyze his reign. And through all this persistence, through all this remembering, through all this survival across 3,000 years, the question remains, why did he do it? What need, what fear, what hope, what ambition, what desire, what vision drove him to build so much, to claim so much, to insist so strenuously on permanence that the insistence itself outlasted everything except the question it raises? The question has no answer, or has many answers, all equally unprovable. Or has answer that Ramses himself might not have been able to articulate, might not have understood, might have justified through divine claims that obscured rather than revealed his actual motivations. The question remains because Ramses remains not as the divine presence he claimed to be, not as the legendary figure he became, but as persistent question mark, as mystery carved into stone, as human being whose humanity is hidden beneath representations that admit no weakness, reveal no doubt, acknowledge no uncertainty, show only confidence and power and divine authority that may have been real or may have been shield against fear of being merely mortal, merely human. Merely temporary presence in world that persists while individuals dissolve. The stone holds its silence. The monuments offer no confession. The mummy cannot speak. And Ramses endures not as answer but as question, not as certainty but as mystery, not as presence that explains itself but as absence disguised as overwhelming presence, as silence that speaks through its refusal to speak, as testimony not to what he was but to what he wanted to be remembered as being, leaving us with monuments that document everything except what we most want to know. What it meant to be Ramses, what it felt like to be that ambitious or that afraid or that confident or that human beneath all the divine claims. What drove him to build forever when he must have known that forever is always temporary, that persistence is always qualified, that even mountains erode and even stone dissolves, and even the most determined attempt to be remembered forever succeeds, only in being remembered for as long as those who remember remain interested in remembering. Which is long time certainly, but is not forever, is not eternity, is not the immortality that monuments promise, but that time ultimately denies to everyone, even to pharaohs who carved their names into mountains and ruled for 6 to 7 years, and claimed to be gods and achieved instead something stranger and perhaps more significant. Achieved being remembered precisely because they cannot be understood, achieved persistence through mystery, achieved immortality not through divine claims, but through leaving question that 3,000 years have not answered and that perhaps can never be answered, making Ramses eternal not as God but as question, not as presence but as absence, not as answer but as persistent, patient, unanswerable mystery carved into stone that will not, cannot explain itself.